Ellen Miller is the executive director of the Sunlight Foundation, and one of the people that you need to hear from if you want to know about where our government is going to go. Ellen Miller. Thank you. All right, so let's start maybe by just asking you to give us a little bit of perspective on what the Sunlight Foundation does. I mean, how many people here already are familiar with Sunlight? And I don't mean you, Clay. Not that many of you. Okay, this is something, seriously, in my job as, a guy who says, pay attention to the Sunlight Foundation.
Well, anyway, when you describe me as a disruptive force, I love that, actually, I have to say. The Sunlight Foundation was founded about 2 years ago. We're into our third year, and our goal was really, has been really to use the internet as a way to catalyze greater openness and transparency in government. So people have said, wow, what a challenge, and indeed it has been a challenge. And so we really started with sort of what are we trying to achieve? What are our basic principles? And our very first principle is pretty simple, which is, you're not public. Information is not public unless it's online. Now, this is a pretty radical notion when you come to talking about government and online information. But it's pretty common sense to everybody in this room and most of the rest of the world. So public means online. Real-time disclosure is absolutely key. I mean, it's terrific to have reports on who's doing what and government data, but if it's 6 months old, it's really not very useful. So our second principle is real-time availability of data and information. And then
that's really critical because obviously if you wait too long, maybe all decisions are passed and it's too late to do anything.
Absolutely. I mean, we're not interested in digitizing government information for academic purposes. Academics may use it, but we're really interested in having this information in the hands of citizens so they can see what government is doing and have some impact on it.
Right.
Our third principle...
feedback loops, really.
I'm sorry?
It's creating feedback loops.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. Well, feedback loops, also known as accountability.
Okay, yeah.
We would call it accountability, us disruptive forces. And the third basic principle really has to do with the first slide, which is, which are basic principles about government data that were developed actually in an event, Tim, that you hosted, convened by Carl Malamud. And that is, again, pretty common sense principles about data. It ought to be complete, it ought to be primary data, it ought to be timely, as we discussed, it ought to be accessible, etc.
Yeah, this was really an attempt to do for data what the open source definition did for software, and where we're really trying to figure out how could we boil down to a set of meta principles, what are the guidelines for how somebody who says we're going to put government data online, what do they need to do it right? And actually, we also had the help of Larry Lessig in drafting this, which was really great.
Well, Tim and I were just talking backstage about how this was actually developed 18 months ago, and we really haven't looked at it much since then. We all felt pretty comfortable with it, and how it's really good even 18 months later. And I think we need to do more with this in terms of particularly pushing it with the new administration in terms of government, what government data ought to look like. What we do, in addition to trying to put forward these principles, is, and let's look at the next slide, is we try to, and let's go one more. This is what government data looks like. I mean, often you're literally fire-hosed with charts and graphs and databases, and it's clearly indigestible. So the next slide shows you what Sunlight tries to do. You got to be able to understand it.
So why are you called the Slider Foundation then?
Well, Sunlight is said to be the best of disinfectants, and so we're named after that. We take our name from that adage from Justice Brandeis. The next slide will show you, this is what the U.S. Congress puts forward in terms of if you want to look at legislative information. It's almost impossible to understand. I have great difficulty with it. So if we look at the next slide, we'll see what Sunlight has done through one of our flagship sites called opencongress.org, which is to make the information more understandable to ordinary citizens and create, the social networking possibilities so people who are interested in particular pieces of legislation can actually use this to connect with each other.
Can I bring up something about opencongress.org? Clay Johnson, who's sitting down there and is running the Sunlight Labs hackathon, told me once there's one of the bills, that some kind of employment bill, has something like 40,000 comments. And
yes.
It's really become a support forum for people who are trying to figure out how to get unemployment benefits.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
And there's this funny thing that's happening where you'd think that ought to be something happening on a government site, but it isn't. And that's part of the challenge that, I'm certainly putting out to this community and why I wanted Ellen to be here. Our government is learning, but it's a very slow learning organization. And we have people who are coming in with all the right talents, but they're trying to move an enormous battleship. For example, there's 3,000 new federal appointees. I think that's the right number. And there's literally tens of millions of government employees. And those employees are wrapped in a system where they have so many limits on them. Like you'd say, oh, you could crowdsource that. And they go, no, actually the Paperwork Reduction Act means that we have to do X, Y, Z in order to ask that question of more than 10 people. And you go, whoa, we got to change the Paperwork Reduction Act, it sounds like. But those kinds of issues really require people like Sunlight and people like you to do things that are so obvious that we know how to do in such a way that the government can pick up on them.
Yeah, actually the next slide, if we can see the next slide, really gives you a sense of what you can do. These are Sunlight developed tools. Earmarks are a big deal in Washington right now. They weren't back in 2006, but no one understands really the impact of earmarks. When you start doing something simple like bubble charts, people can understand. And so this is, again, one of the things that Sunlight does, as is the next chart, which is, let's look at the next slide. This is, the arrival of transparency. This is data from the New York Times and just, a visualization of the word transparency and how much it's been used, over the last, I think it's 3 or 4 years. Sunlight's role is to make information available in this way that ordinary people can really understand. So those are our 3 big things: digitizing information, making better filters for it, and providing the big picture.
So, I guess there's 2 questions. One, how do people get involved? What do you want out of this audience?
Well, actually there's, why don't we look at the next slide? There are lots of ways for the tech community to contribute to what Sunlight does. Sunlight has a labs, one of our divisions, if you will, has a labs, and we really would love people to join the Sunlight Labs, and there's the URL for that. We really want people to contribute their own, ideas in their projects. We have just recently developed something we're calling a 50-state project. You can find all of these ideas actually on the Sunlight Wiki. We have a hackathon ongoing here, and I know that our labs team, which is here, would love for people to come by and begin to hack away on some of these 50-state projects that are there.
In fact, I will say, by the way, Clay's in the audience, so don't go rushing down there, because he won't be there. But I just do want to say I gave Clay a stack of my business cards signed with giveaways, including a couple of conference passes, a bunch of free O'Reilly books that he can give away to people who really make a contribution. So those of you who are tweeting, pass that out to the world. People who aren't at the conference, come by later today or tomorrow, help Clay out.
One of the things that we're doing is we're literally redesigning government sort of agency by agency. We've done the EPA, we did the Federal Election Commission. I think anybody here should just go out and take a look at some government website, and without question, you'll have terrific ideas about how it could be done better. Just do it.
How do we actually get that adopted by the government? Maybe I talked in my keynote yesterday about fedspending.org and how that led to usaspending.gov. Could you talk a little bit about that process and how something goes from the private sector, or in your case, I don't know what you call it, the public domain sector, into the government sector?
Well, I think there's no clear path for doing this. But my hunch, and I think Sunlight's hunch generally, is if there are models that are built on the outside, the government will see what is being done. It'll see that it's being done for far cheaper than the way government spends money to get things done, and will begin to adopt the practices. For example, we redesigned the website for the Federal Election Commission. This is the agency that collects all the campaign finance information for federal candidates. They have one of the world's worst websites. So we just redesigned it, and the next day, most of our traffic that day on the Sunlight Labs site came from the Federal Election Commission, and within hours we had a call from the chairman and said, could we meet? Because the change was so dramatic. And so we found that, and we found that happened, sort of across the agencies. Whenever we, design something for them, there are interested people in government who really do want to do it better. So
yeah, that's the thing. When I was in Washington last month, I was just incredibly impressed by how many talented people there are, people of goodwill, people who, are like the best of us out here. They're highly skilled, and yet it's really hard environment to make things happen.
Yeah, it is a difficult environment to make things happen. The whole phenomenon of sort of the second layer of people who have been the technologists in government, who have not had the opportunity to shine. My dear friend and board member, Craig Newmark, and I don't know if Craig is here, likes to call it the revenge of the nerds. Yeah. That they have been there, they are now being given license actually to proceed. Yeah. You're seeing this bubbling up, inside government, but I think also a great deal of interest, from outside of government, whether it's nonprofits or for-profits that have ideas. The goal, I think, is to put them out there and show government what could be done.
So just want to have you highlight, I mentioned this yesterday in my keynote, again, this Fed spending, USA spending. What was your original budget and what was their original budget and what happened?
Well, it really is, it is a great story of how Washington can work.
This is really the less is more theme here.
Yes, exactly, exactly, and how it doesn't have to cost millions or tens of millions of dollars to get things done. Very early on, Sunlight made very early grants to a number of nonprofits to create publicly available databases where none existed. And one of those went to a nonprofit to create fedspending.org.
It's OMB Watch, right?
It was called OMB Watch, is the nonprofit. It was a 3-year grant. It was $320,000. And within, I think, about 9 months, or maybe slightly less than that, they had up the basic data going back for 5 to 7 years. And it was immediately very popular. Within 9 months after that database was launched, the federal government was required to create a nearly identical database, which they now call usaspending.gov. And the appropriation for that database, the government appropriation, was $12 million. So we were just like dumbstruck by how could a similar database cost that many more times. In fact, because the federal government, OMB, was under a great deal of pressure to get the database up quickly, they purchased the license from the nonprofit for $600,000, and now there are nearly 2 identical databases that are operating, the nonprofit, and the other for the federal government. They both have different strengths and weaknesses. The federal government's database is a little bit more current, but it isn't categorized and it is not quite as detailed as the nonprofit.
But they got a big leg up from so 20-to-1 leverage really in terms of the cost.
In terms of the cost,
yeah.
It's just breathtaking. I mean, it's a great illustration. There is no reason while the federal government has to spend what they spend on technology, and then I think this is a huge opportunity.
Well, and I think the theme that I really want to get across is just how important it is because we have huge problems. We still got to spend that $12 million, say, but let's spend it on now the 20 other databases that we haven't got to yet.
Yeah, exactly.
Hey, I want to switch to audience questions while we still have time. We've been soliciting them on Google Moderator. If you want to get something else in, you can go to bit.ly/askellen and submit more questions, but I'm going to go from the ones we've already got. So the first one looks like it's from somebody who identified themselves as Team A in Los Angeles. and that is, who are the most active reps on government transparency via technology? I mean, who are our allies who get it?
Well, there's hardly a person who will say they're against transparency, but they're not
to the other guy.
To the other guy, but there are not a lot who really understand technology. But interestingly, the Speaker of the House, Nancy Pelosi, happens to be one of those people who really get technology, and so she has moved forward in both her own use of technology and in pushing the House into early use of technology. What's interesting is that her counterpart, the minority leader, John Boehner, perhaps for partisan reasons, but has also jumped onto the technology as a way to improve transparency bandwagon. We now actually had both the Democrats and the Republicans sort of vying for who could be more transparent. I mean, until one of our recent examples of trying to bring the House into the 21st century using both Democrats and Republicans was the fact that until very recently, the House rules prohibited the use of any social media. So anybody who was using Twitter, anybody who was using YouTube, anyone who was using Facebook.
John Culberson from Texas really
was
pushed
doing
the
it
envelope
illegally.
on that.
And so we had this very conservative Republican, John Culberson from Texas.
Yeah.
And he was just very bold and very out there, helping to push the Democratic leadership into allowing this to happen. And Sunlight actually launched a Let Our Congress Tweet campaign. And we also, were one of the people who were pushing and shoving, and now members of Congress can tweet, for better or worse.
When I met John Culberson, I thought, man, this guy is like Scobelizer's twin. Imagine Scoble in Congress. He's just running around with his quick camera and.
Yeah, exactly. But there are a number of other members who stand out. Representative Honda, for one, was an early user, and it's been an early leader. Lofgren. There are a number of people that we often turn to. But I don't want to fool people, and I don't want to fool you, Tim. There is a cultural resistance, I think perhaps more in Congress than in the executive branch now, to the notion of greater transparency. It's not so much a fear of technology, it's just a fear of losing power, of losing control. So there is a resistance there.
Yeah, I guess there's sort of this issue of, Congress wants transparency for the executive, right, but not for themselves.
Of course. There's always for the other side, for the other part of the branch. But I think transparency will be done to them. Mm-hmm. This is what one of our conservative allies pointed out. I mean, whether it's the Sunlight Foundation providing grants to organizations to digitize data which has never been digitized before, and so we're doing transparency to the executive branch or to the Congress, I think they will come around.
Yeah, next question here, this number 2 on the list, is a little bit of a cheating question because it's Clay Johnson who asks, what's next for Sunlight? I have a feeling that Clay knows. He just wants you to talk about it.
Clay does know what's next for Sunlight. It's one thing to create various databases of government information, and the databases that we're particularly interested in have to do with the influence exerted on the executive branch and members of Congress and the result of that. So we're very interested in campaign finance information, lobbying information, who works for whom, when in their career, kind of information. So we have all these databases now created, and what we want to try to do next is to create something we're calling a data commons, where you combine federal campaign finance and state campaign finance, federal lobbying, state lobbying. We've never been able to do this before. These databases do not talk to each other. They were created in different times, different places. And so our Sunlight Lab's biggest challenge is to create this data repository and really serve as a way to mash this data up and pull it, so we as citizens can pull it out and look across these various databases. It's been certainly a long-time ambition of mine. And a second piece would be to continue to create and innovate on tools to access data and to make it more meaningful so that members of Congress and the executive can be held accountable for what they do. And the third piece of our major piece of our next effort is really to change how Washington makes information available. So we're really talking about launching a major campaign for, to increase what government does. Sunlight is a nonprofit organization. We do not actually think it is the nonprofit's responsibility to provide transparency for government work. We think it's government's responsibility to do this. What a novel idea.
Yeah, so, this is jumping away from the questions on Google Moderator to something that I've seen quite a bit on Twitter. Actually, I submitted it to Moderator myself because it was a summary of things that I hear. A lot of libertarians say, we need less government. Just forget this. Why are you, trying to help? Just make them go away. How do you respond to the people who think that, we shouldn't be dealing with government at all? We just shouldn't have any.
Well, I think, I guess our experience in Washington shows us that using technology to create greater transparency really is a transpartisan issue. So not bipartisan, transpartisan issue. There are many people who are libertarians, some of whom we have supported, many conservatives we work with, many progressives that we work with. But there is a general understanding that whatever data that government collects, it ought to be available and easy in our hands, easily put into our hands, whether it's the basic raw data or the tools that make it easily accessible. People will do, given their political persuasions, whatever they want to do with the data, but the notion that government's data is our data is an idea that really crosses all political lines.
So Conrad Johnson asks, are there dual business / contributory, I assume he means nonprofit, opportunities for this audience with the government data being standardized and accessible? He says, hey, we got to eat too. In other words, how do I make money at this?
Well, I think there are lots of ways to make money on this. Government is spending far more than they need to in order to get their projects up and running. I cannot confirm this at the moment, although perhaps my colleague Clay can, but just before I came on stage, I heard the figure that the new website that government has created called recovery.gov has cost or will cost $86 million to create. I suspect there's a way to do it a lot cheaper. Now, I haven't confirmed this figure yet. And I also suspect that in this very audience, there are people who could do it for a lot less than that and still make a lot of money.
2, maybe even 3 orders of magnitude less.
Indeed. That figure is dumbfounding to me.
But it is dumbfounding. And that actually, again, going back to the conference that we do hope to launch there, it really is to get more of you there in Washington and to figure out how do we run the knobs and levers of that system so that we can, in fact, make some advances.
One of the things that I do know is that the new federal CIO, Vivek Kundra, very much understands that the community has a lot to contribute, that it will significantly reduce government costs for the various databases and programs that they want to create. And so the government has a new openness, to this community.
So that really is the vision, I think, if we can turn government into a platform that allows people to innovate, as opposed to, I love this phrase that Frank DiGiamarino at the National Academy of Public Administration uses. He says, right now we kind of have this idea of vending machine government. You put in your taxes and you get out services, as opposed to this generative platform that we kind of have out here on the open web.
Yeah, that's the kind of attitude we're now seeing coming out of the new administration. Yeah. And I think that is obviously a significant difference, not just with the past administration, but going back in time. There is a new attitude about the use of technology, both to improve the quality of government service, but generally as a way to engage people who've not been engaged before, and to break the stranglehold that a very few big government contractors have had. This administration is going to be open to people who've not been big players in Washington for a long time.
Well, let's try to make it happen. If Web 2.0 is the web as platform, Gov 2 has got to be the government as platform.
Let's
make good things happen. Thank you very much, Ellen.
Thank you.
And thanks so much for your work on our behalf.
Thanks.
You guys are really making a difference.
Thank you.
Thank you.